Your name is Marcus. You're 13 years old, and you're standing naked on a wooden platform in Rome's Forum Barium, while hundreds of wealthy Romans examine your body like livestock. The placard hanging around your neck reads, Greek origin, literate, musical training, virgin, in Latin letters you've been forced to learn. Your hands are bound behind your back as potential buyers squeeze your arms to test muscle tone, examine your teeth for signs of disease, and discuss your future as if you can't understand every word they're saying. Just 3 months ago, you were a free boy in Athens, learning mathematics from your father and playing with friends in marble courtyards where philosophers once walked. Now you're property, standing between a Gallic warrior and a batch of Syrian girls while Roman matrons debate whether your Greek accent will be charming enough for their dinner parties. The iron collar around your neck bears fresh scratches from your futile attempts to remove it during the ship journey that brought you here. The auctioneer's voice booms across the crowded market as he describes your special qualities to bidders who see you as an investment rather than a human being. He explains that Greek boys like you are prized for their intelligence and refinement, perfect for households that want to display their sophistication through ownership of cultured foreign property. What he doesn't mention is what happens to boys like you once those marble doors close behind you. You're about to enter a world where luxury and horror exist, side by side, where golden couches and silk cushions can't hide the reality that you're completely at the mercy of people who've paid good money for the right to reshape your body, mind, and future according to their desires. The Roman elite didn't just buy slaves to perform labor. They bought human beings to mold into living symbols of their power and taste. You think you know about Roman slavery from movies and history books. The gladiators, the household servants, the agricultural workers building an empire? Here's what they don't show you. Behind the marble columns and impressive architecture was a system that turned children into luxury goods, where being beautiful and intelligent made your fate worse, not better. One particular practice they're about to subject you to was so disturbing that Roman legal scholars who wrote extensively about property rights refused to document the specific procedures involved. The most haunting part? Many boys learn to see their transformation as privilege rather than punishment. Before we follow Marcus through his descent into Roman elite society, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you can handle the truth about what Roman civilization really meant for vulnerable children, subscribe and hit the like button, because what you're about to discover will shatter every heroic myth about ancient Rome. Your new master is already approaching the platform, and his smile terrifies you more than his words ever could. The moment Marcus stepped onto the auction block at Rome's Forum Barium, his transformation from human being to commodity became complete and irreversible. The slave market operated with the efficiency of a modern stock exchange, complete with detailed documentation that treated children like inventory to be cataloged, evaluated, and distributed according to market demands that prioritized beauty and intelligence over strength or skill. The placard system was deliberately designed to reduce human beings to lists of exploitable characteristics. Marcus's sign didn't just identify his origin and age, but advertised specific qualities that wealthy Romans found appealing in young male slaves. Greek origins signaled education and cultural refinement. Literate meant he could serve as a secretary or tutor. Musical training suggested entertainment value. Virgin indicated he was untouched merchandise, ready for whatever purposes his new owner might devise. The examination process was systematic and invasive, designed to verify the claims made in the documentation while establishing the buyer's complete authority over their future property. Potential purchasers ran their hands over Marcus's body with the clinical detachment of livestock appraisers, checking muscle tone, examining skin for scars or defects, and testing his reflexes and responses to determine his suitability for various household roles. Roman matron Livia Drusilla approached the platform with the practiced eye of someone who'd purchased dozens of slaves over the years. She examined Marcus's hands to assess his potential for delicate work, tested his knowledge of Greek poetry to verify his education, and had him walk back and forth to evaluate his grace and deportment. To her, he wasn't a terrified child, but raw material that could enhance her household's reputation for sophistication and taste. The bidding process revealed the twisted economics that drove Rome's appetite for young male slaves. Marcus commanded a price equivalent to what a skilled craftsman might earn in 3 years, not because of his potential for manual labor, but because of his suitability for intimate household service. The final bid of 8,000 denarii reflected his value as a luxury item that would demonstrate his owner's wealth and refined taste. But the sale itself was just the beginning of Marcus's nightmare. Roman law treated slaves as res, things rather than people, meaning that his new owner, Gaius Flavius, possessed absolute legal authority over every aspect of his existence. Flavius could modify Marcus's body, change his name, determine his diet, control his sleep, and shape his behavior according to whatever whims or desires might occur to him. The legal framework surrounding slave ownership was comprehensive and ruthless. The 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code, specified that slaves were property like furniture or livestock, with no rights to refuse their master's commands, regardless of what those commands might involve. Masters who killed their slaves faced minimal consequences, while slaves who resisted their masters faced death by crucifixion or worse. Flavius's household represented the pinnacle of Roman luxury, complete with imported marble floors, Egyptian silk curtains, and artwork looted from conquered territories across the Mediterranean. But for Marcus, these beautiful surroundings were just the gilded cage where his real education would begin. He was about to learn that Roman elite culture had developed sophisticated methods for transforming children into willing participants in their own exploitation. The iron collar locked around Marcus's neck bore his new owner's name and address, marking him as Flavius' property in case he attempted escape. But more importantly, it served as a constant psychological reminder that his previous identity as a free Greek boy was gone forever. He was now Marcus Flavius, named after his master, and his survival depended entirely on how successfully he could adapt to his new role as human property. As the guards led Marcus away from the auction block toward his new life in Flavius's villa, he couldn't know that the luxury awaiting him would be more terrifying than the harsh labor he had expected. Roman elite households didn't want broken slaves, but perfectly conditioned human ornaments who would reflect their owner's sophistication through their beauty, grace, and absolute obedience. Within hours of arriving at Flavius's villa, Marcus discovered that life as a household slave involved psychological control far more sophisticated than simple physical coercion. He was assigned to the delicati, a select group of young male slaves chosen for their beauty and intelligence to serve at intimate family gatherings, where their grace and refinement would demonstrate their master's exceptional taste in human property. The training process began immediately with lessons designed to reshape every aspect of Marcus's personality and behavior. He learned to move with fluid elegance that would please Roman aesthetic sensibilities, to speak in modulated tones that conveyed respect without suggesting independent thought, and to anticipate his master's needs before they were spoken. This wasn't just education, but systematic erasure of his previous identity as a free person. Marcus's daily routine involved practices that blurred the line between luxury and degradation. He bathed in water perfumed with expensive oils imported from Egypt, wore silk tunics that cost more than most Romans earned in months, and slept on cushions stuffed with down from exotic birds. But every comfort came with conditions that reinforced his status as property rather than person. The villa's other slaves taught Marcus the unwritten rules that governed household hierarchy and survival. He learned which rooms to avoid during certain hours, which family members required specific types of attention, and how to interpret the subtle signals that indicated when his services might be required for activities that weren't discussed openly but were understood by everyone in the household. Flavius's dinner parties provided Marcus with his first glimpse of how Roman elite society used young male slaves as living symbols of power and sophistication. He served wine to guests who discussed philosophy and politics while treating him as animated furniture, pouring drinks and arranging cushions while remaining invisible, unless specifically summoned for entertainment or conversation. The psychological conditioning was relentless and effective. Marcus learned to find pride in his ability to please demanding masters, to see his beauty and intelligence as assets that elevated him above common slaves, and to compete with other household delicati for access to the privileges that came with being a favored servant. The villa staff encouraged this competition because it prevented slaves from forming alliances that might threaten household stability. But Marcus's education went beyond simple domestic service into areas that would have horrified his parents in Athens. He received instruction in massage techniques that involved intimate contact with his master's body, learned to assist with bathing rituals that required him to handle Flavius in ways that violated every concept of appropriate behavior he'd learned as a free child. The other delicati warned Marcus that resistance or hesitation during these intimate services would result in punishment that might include sale to much worse situations. They described brothels where slave boys faced dozens of customers daily, gladiator schools where beautiful slaves were used for entertainment between fights, and private estates where owners with more extreme tastes pursued activities that household slaves only whispered about in dark corners. Flavius himself seemed almost kind compared to the horrors that other masters inflicted on their property. He praised Marcus's quick learning, rewarded good behavior with small privileges like extra food or softer bedding, and spoke to him in Latin that suggested respect rather than contempt. But Marcus gradually understood that this apparent kindness was actually a more sophisticated form of control designed to make him grateful for treatment that was still fundamentally abusive. The villa's luxury became a psychological prison that made escape seem impossible, even when physical restraints were minimal. Marcus wore expensive clothes, ate fine food, and lived in beautiful surroundings that elevated him far above the conditions experienced by most slaves. But every comfort reinforced his dependence on his master's goodwill and made the prospect of freedom seem less appealing than continued servitude in golden chains. Roman household management treated human beings as investments that required careful maintenance to preserve their value and appearance. Marcus received medical care, educational instruction, and physical training not because Flavius cared about his well-being, but because healthy, intelligent, beautiful slaves commanded higher resale values and reflected better on their owner's judgment and taste. But the most insidious aspect of Marcus's conditioning was how it taught him to see his situation as privilege rather than exploitation. Compared to agricultural slaves who died young from overwork, gladiators who faced death for entertainment, or brothel slaves who were discarded when their beauty faded, household service seemed like luxury, worth preserving through absolute obedience and gratitude. 6 months into his service at Flavius's villa, Marcus learned about the procedure that Roman elite families used to ensure their most valued slaves remained permanently dependent and docile. The practice of creating spadones, castrated male slaves, represented the ultimate expression of Roman control over human property, transforming boys into permanent children who could never threaten their master's authority through physical development or sexual autonomy. The legal framework surrounding castration was deliberately ambiguous and hypocritical. The Lex Cornelia officially prohibited the castration of freeborn Romans and technically extended some protection to slaves, but enforcement was practically non-existent when wealthy families wanted to preserve their investment in beautiful young servants. Roman courts consistently ruled that masters had absolute authority over their property, including the right to modify slave bodies for household efficiency. Flavius explained the procedure to Marcus with a clinical detachment of a businessman discussing equipment maintenance. The operation would ensure that Marcus retained his youthful appearance and soft voice indefinitely, making him a more valuable and aesthetically pleasing household ornament. Eastern slaves from Parthia and Syria commanded premium prices specifically because they'd undergone this transformation, and Roman buyers increasingly expected similar modifications in their domestic servants. The medical reality of castration in ancient Rome was primitive and horrifying. The procedure typically involved crushing or removing the testicles using crude instruments and techniques that caused excruciating pain, while offering no real anesthesia beyond wine or opium preparations that were frequently ineffective. Survival rates were extremely low, with most boys dying from infection, blood loss, or shock within days of the operation. But the physical danger was only part of the horror. Roman physicians understood that castration would fundamentally alter Marcus's psychological development, preventing normal sexual maturation while creating permanent dependency on his master for emotional validation and social identity. Spadones never developed the physical strength or emotional independence that might threaten household stability, making them ideal servants for intimate family situations. The procedure took place in a specially prepared chamber within the villa, attended by a Greek physician who specialized in slave modifications and several household staff who would assist with restraint and aftercare. Marcus was given enough wine to dull the immediate pain, but not enough to cause unconsciousness, as the physician needed him aware enough to cooperate during the operation and respond to instructions about positioning and breathing. Contemporary medical texts describe the castration process in clinical detail that reveals both its systematic nature and its psychological impact on victims. The physician began by restraining Marcus on a wooden table specifically designed for such procedures, with leather straps that prevented movement while allowing access to the surgical site. The actual cutting was performed with bronze instruments that had been heated in flames to prevent infection, though this primitive sterilization was largely ineffective. The psychological trauma of castration extended far beyond the physical pain and recovery period. Marcus understood that he was being permanently altered to serve his master's convenience, transformed from a whole human being into a customized tool designed for specific household functions. The procedure represented the ultimate denial of his autonomy and future potential as an adult capable of independent life. Roman elite families justified castration through elaborate theological and philosophical arguments that portrayed the practice as beneficial to both slave and master. They claimed that removing sexual desire would allow slaves to focus entirely on service duties, that preventing reproduction would eliminate complications from slave families, and that preserving youthful beauty would honor the aesthetic values that defined civilized society. The recovery process was deliberately designed to reinforce the slave's complete dependence on his master's medical knowledge and household resources. Marcus spent weeks in a specialized chamber, where he received careful attention from villa staff, who explained that his survival depended entirely on following their instructions about diet, movement, and behavior. This medical dependency created psychological bonds that made escape seem impossible even after physical healing was complete. Flavius visited Marcus daily during his recovery, expressing concern for his well-being while explaining how his new condition would benefit both of them. He described the advantages of remaining forever young and beautiful, the security of never having to worry about romantic complications, and the special status that Spadones enjoyed in Roman elite society as uniquely trustworthy and refined servants. The operation's success made Marcus a more valuable asset who could be displayed at social gatherings as evidence of his master's sophisticated taste and willingness to invest in the finest human ornaments. But it also marked his transformation from a human being with potential for independence into a permanent child whose entire existence would revolve around pleasing adults who owned his modified body. Marcus's reputation as a perfectly conditioned spadone eventually reached the attention of imperial procurement agents who recruited exceptional household slaves for service in the Palatine Palace complex, where the emperor's most intimate needs were attended by young men whose beauty and obedience had been refined to artistic levels through years of systematic conditioning and modification. Life at the imperial court represented the pinnacle of Roman luxury and the depths of human degradation, operating simultaneously within marble halls, where slaves like Marcus served the most powerful men in the world, while remaining completely powerless themselves. The palace complex employed hundreds of young male servants whose primary qualifications were their modified bodies, their absolute obedience, and their ability to provide services that imperial propaganda carefully avoided describing in detail. The selection process for imperial service involved examinations that surpassed even the invasive inspections of the slave markets. Palace officials assessed not just physical beauty and domestic skills, but psychological suitability for the intimate access that palace service would require. They looked for slaves who had been so thoroughly conditioned that they would never question or resist imperial demands regardless of how extreme those demands might become. Marcus was assigned to the personal household of Emperor Tiberius, who had retired to his villa on Capri, where he pursued activities that Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus documented in accounts so disturbing that later scholars questioned their accuracy. But archaeological evidence from Capri supports many of these historical claims, revealing specialized facilities and equipment that could only have served the purposes described in ancient sources. The daily routine at Capri involved services that tested the limits of human endurance and dignity. Marcus learned to participate in rituals that combined religious ceremony with systematic abuse, entertainment that turned human suffering into imperial amusement, and private sessions where his modified body served functions that Roman law would have punished by death if performed between free citizens. Contemporary accounts describe the psychological atmosphere at Tiberius's court as a combination of terror and competitive servitude, where palace slaves competed for imperial attention, while understanding that such attention often resulted in permanent damage or death. The emperor's favor was simultaneously the greatest privilege and the most dangerous threat that palace servants could experience. The most notorious aspect of imperial service was the creation of specialized entertainments that transformed systematic abuse into artistic performance. Marcus participated in theatrical presentations where slaves reenacted mythological scenes involving transformation, submission, and destruction. These weren't just entertainment, but religious ceremonies where imperial power was celebrated through the systematic degradation of human beings who had been modified specifically for such purposes. Palace records document the procurement and disposal of servants with the same clinical efficiency that characterized military supply operations. Young men like Marcus were acquired, modified, used for specific periods, and replaced when their beauty faded or their conditioning broke down under the pressure of imperial service. The palace operated like a sophisticated machine that consumed human beings to fuel imperial pleasure and political authority. The psychological conditioning required for imperial service went beyond anything that household slaves experienced. Palace servants learned to interpret the emperor's desires before they were expressed, to endure physical and emotional abuse while appearing grateful for the privilege, and to participate in activities that violated every natural human instinct while maintaining the fiction that such service was honorable and divinely ordained. Marcus's transformation was so complete that he genuinely believed his suffering served a higher purpose. Imperial propaganda had convinced him that his modified body and broken spirit were contributions to the stability of an empire that brought civilization to barbarian peoples across the Mediterranean. His pain had been transformed into patriotic duty, his degradation into religious service. The international implications of imperial intimate practices were carefully managed through diplomatic protocols that prevented foreign observers from witnessing the full extent of palace activities. But rumors spread throughout the ancient world about Roman emperors whose appetites exceeded those of Eastern despots, creating a reputation for sophisticated cruelty that influenced how other kingdoms approached diplomatic relationships with Rome. The palace's marble halls and golden furnishings couldn't disguise the reality that imperial court life represented systematic human destruction disguised as luxury service. Marcus lived in beautiful surroundings, while experiencing daily horrors that would have challenged the endurance of gladiators trained for arena combat. His life had become a careful balance between maintaining his usefulness to imperial desires and preserving enough of himself to survive each day's demands. The systematic abuse that defined Marcus's existence wasn't an aberration within Roman civilization, but a fundamental component of the empire's social and economic structure. The same legal frameworks that protected property rights and maintained social order also facilitated the transformation of human beings into luxury goods, whose suffering was hidden behind architectural grandeur and philosophical sophistication. Archaeological evidence from across the Roman Empire reveals the widespread nature of practices that Roman historians either ignored or described in euphemistic language designed to obscure their true character. Excavations at villa sites from Britain to Syria have uncovered specialized facilities, restraint equipment, and medical instruments that confirm the systematic nature of intimate abuse, disguised as household management and religious observance. The economic data is equally disturbing. Roman tax records and trade documents show that modified slaves commanded prices equivalent to valuable real estate, with specific premiums paid for boys who had undergone successful conditioning and surgical alteration. The empire's prosperity wasn't just built on military conquest and agricultural production, but on sophisticated markets in human suffering that operated with legal sanction and social approval. Contemporary sources from other ancient civilizations expressed shock at Roman practices that exceeded anything they had witnessed in their own societies. Greek philosophers who visited Rome wrote about moral corruption that challenged their understanding of civilized behavior, while Persian and Germanic observers described Roman elite culture as systematically depraved in ways that seemed to violate natural human instincts. The psychological impact on Roman society was profound and lasting. Citizens who grew up witnessing systematic abuse as normal elite behavior developed tolerance for cruelty that influenced everything from military tactics to family relationships. Roman children learned that human suffering was acceptable entertainment when it involved people who had been legally classified as property rather than persons. The institutional enablers included not just wealthy families, but the entire legal, medical, and religious establishment that provided justification and practical support for systematic human exploitation. Roman physicians developed specialized expertise in modification procedures. Lawyers crafted legal arguments that protected abusive practices, and priests created theological frameworks that portrayed cruelty as religiously sanctioned social order. The cover-up began even during the imperial period, as Roman historians struggled to document practices that challenged their propaganda about civilization and moral superiority. Writers like Tacitus and Suetonius preserved enough detail to reveal the systematic nature of imperial abuse while using language that allowed later scholars to dismiss their accounts as political propaganda or moral exaggeration. Modern archaeological discoveries have forced classical scholars to confront evidence that confirms the most disturbing ancient accounts, while revealing additional practices that even contemporary sources were reluctant to describe fully. DNA analysis, bone studies, and artifact examination provide scientific confirmation of systematic abuse that operated for centuries across the entire Mediterranean world. The parallels to modern trafficking operations are undeniable and should be deeply disturbing to anyone who believes that technological progress automatically produces moral advancement. The Romans developed sophisticated methods for identifying, acquiring, conditioning, and exploiting vulnerable children that surpass many contemporary criminal organizations in their systematic efficiency and social integration. Understanding Roman intimate practices isn't just historical curiosity, but essential knowledge for recognizing how quickly civilized societies can normalize extreme cruelty when it serves the interests of powerful groups. The legal, economic, and social frameworks that supported Roman systematic abuse continue to operate in modified forms wherever institutions protect perpetrators while silencing victims. The deliberate historical concealment of these practices represents ongoing complicity in crimes that shaped Western civilization for centuries. By sanitizing Roman history into tales of architectural achievement and legal innovation, modern education avoids confronting uncomfortable truths about the human cost of imperial grandeur and the ease with which systematic violence can become culturally celebrated. Marcus died young, worn out by years of systematic abuse that had broken his body and spirit while preserving his beauty long enough to serve imperial purposes. He represents thousands of forgotten victims whose suffering built the foundation of classical civilization, children whose names we'll never know, but whose stories remind us that human dignity must be actively protected against institutions that treat people as commodities, to be modified and consumed according to the desires of those with sufficient power to purchase human beings. Marcus never lived to see his 20th birthday, his modified body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of years serving Roman masters who saw him as an artistic creation rather than a human being. He died believing his suffering had served a noble purpose, his conditioning so complete that he experienced his destruction as privilege rather than exploitation. His story represents thousands of young men whose lives were systematically destroyed to satisfy Roman elite appetites for luxury that extended to human property, modified according to their aesthetic preferences and intimate desires. These weren't isolated cases of individual cruelty, but evidence of institutional systems that operated for centuries with legal protection and social approval. What makes Marcus's fate particularly horrifying isn't just the physical procedures he endured, but the sophisticated psychological conditioning that made him grateful for treatment that violated every principle of human dignity. Roman elite society had perfected methods for transforming children into willing participants in their own exploitation, creating victims who defended their abusers and competed for the privilege of serving masters who saw them as animated artwork. The religious and legal justifications for systematic abuse reveal how easily civilized institutions can be corrupted to facilitate rather than prevent human trafficking and exploitation. When laws treat people as property and religions celebrate suffering as divine service, entire societies can participate in systematic cruelty while maintaining the illusion that such behavior represents moral sophistication rather than criminal violence. The ongoing romanticization of Roman civilization represents historical denial that protects modern sensibilities while dishonoring the memory of victims like Marcus. By focusing on architectural achievements and legal innovations, while ignoring the systematic abuse that funded imperial grandeur, we participate in covering up crimes that shaped Western development for over 1,000 years. Understanding these forgotten horrors reminds us that human dignity isn't guaranteed by technological advancement, legal sophistication, or cultural achievement, but must be actively protected by people willing to confront uncomfortable truths about what our species is capable of inflicting. When power goes unchecked and cruelty becomes institutionally normalized. Next time you see romanticized depictions of Roman civilization in movies or museums, remember Marcus and the real children whose modified bodies and broken spirits built the foundation of classical culture. Their stories represent the ultimate warning about what happens when human beings become commodities in systems that prioritize luxury over basic human dignity. If these forgotten voices matter to you, subscribe for more investigations into history's hidden darkness. Let me know in the comments which buried truth you want me to uncover next, because there are so many more disturbing stories waiting to be told.